Hello and welcome to First Dates and Soulmates, where we are going to be talking about the genre of heroines, harlots, himbos, and that all-important HEA, happily ever after. I am Meg, I'm your co-host, and I'm joined today by...
I am Nikki, and we are talking about a very popular trope in the romance oeuvre today. Enemies to lovers.
Lovers.
I feel like dramatic music here, Meg. All right, enemies to lovers, very popular trope, or as Tumblr user Books and Other Secrets likes to call it, enemies to lovers romance is the journey from sweetheart in a derogatory way to sweetheart with affection. Meg, enemies to lovers, where does this stand on your hate it, love it scale?
I would say that it's in my top 10 in terms of tropes. You know, like in every book, you're going to need to have internal conflict and external conflict. But the thing that I love about romance is that you do have two or more people who are in relationship with each other. And the easiest thing is just make them friends. But if they're not friends, it's like you have that much more to overcome. It's not just, you know, here's what's happening out in the world and here's what's happening inside my brain, but also like, why don't they get along? And you get that turning point of when they finally start to see each other differently. That's so satisfying.
Ooh, I do like that. I think that's one of the reasons that like I do like enemies to lovers. I'll say dislike to lovers. Because one of the things I think it's also interesting to point out within this trope, within the genre, is that enemies to lovers has been kind of cobbled together to mean anybody that like they just dislike each other to they like each other, as opposed to like being straight up like enemies, where we hate and we want to kill each other. So I think it'll be interesting as we get into the discussion to talk about the different ways that enemies to lovers can manifest. But yeah, I totally agree. I love this tension that exists between them, that, you know, all they see are flaws, and perhaps those flaws are mirrored within themselves. Ooh, character development. But I do like it as a point of tension, because there is like whatever the plot tension is, whatever is plot, this happens, then B, so that C. But there's also that tension within them of like, I just hate this person, or I want bad things to happen to this person. So they've got to navigate, as you say, like that internal conflict as well. So I do think it provides authors with ample opportunity to really go inside the characters' hearts and brains as much as they do where are they going and what are they doing. So I will say I'm a fan.
Yeah, and I think also there's a certain amount of conflict but there's just a friction that happens there that makes it a lot more interesting as a reader, because you know by the premise of the genre that they're going to end up together. So like, how do they get there? So the more they dislike each other at the end, it feels like the payoff is greater at the end of it. And I think you're right to call out that like enemies is kind of a generalized term, and enemies can be true, but often in contemporaries it can be much more like of a rivalry versus enemy, where they've been pitted against each other in some sort of circumstance and they don't get along and they have different values, and that's what makes it interesting.
So here's a little Nikki's book corner for you on where did enemies to lovers like originate? So obviously literature is old as time, but in a Daily Star article by Sarah Kabir, she kind of remarked on like, when did this trope start? And in her article, she's saying that one of the earliest recorded uses of this trope in Western literature was in the novel Le Morte d'Arthur, written by Sir Thomas Malory in 1485, and it is commonly known that is the first English novel. And basically the little log line for this book is, though Lady Lynette is wary of and rude to Lord Gareth when they first meet, mistaking him for a lowly kitchen knave, his chivalry, patience, and bravery ultimately win her over. And wow, same thing, 1485 to now, same. I'm like, you knave, I think I like you. So
there's a mistaken identity component here. There's some judgment that happens. There's an, the first impression goes poorly. Like, it all sets it up right there. I love that.
It's very true. So, Meg, when we talk about enemies to lovers, are there any instances for you personally where you're like, ooh, I see that they're using enemies to lovers and like, this is not a good enemies to lovers? Like for me, enemies to lovers has the potential to kind of like roll into abuse or like weird like manipulation of feelings, because he's my enemy. He or she or they must also be like this this evil persona. So like, I don't really like this. When this trope is used, and it's like they were torturing me, but they love me, and they became a
So
nice guy.
I think there's a difference between enemies to lovers and bully to lovers, which
Yes.
is sort of what you're discussing here. And personally, I'm not comfortable with like a bully or abuse space. I've read several of them and they always leave me feeling a little squicky. They're often in the, he was mean to me in middle school or high school, and then we met up later in college or, later on, and he had grown, but I still have this negative emotion towards him, where like that to me, there is an abuse component and you have to work a lot harder as an author to make that person likable. An
Mm-hmm.
example that comes to mind for me with that is Against the Wall by Kate Wells. But it's like people, especially on Reddit, people on the romance subreddit love Cash Wall, but because he's a himbo, because he's kind of an idiot, because he's like
Mm-hmm.
desperately in love with this girl, but he didn't know how to talk to her in high school, and therefore he was mean to her and he bullied her,
Yeah.
and he was popular and she was a wallflower. And that to me isn't enemies to lovers either. It's a bully. Right. So I
Mm-hmm.
think also like sometimes things will roll into this is the genre of enemies to lovers, but I think enemies also has to be two-sided. It has to be they both dislike each other, not one person was mean to the other. I think that that's a very different
Mm.
dynamic than what I would consider to be enemies to lovers.
I agree with you on that. So for today's discussion, I have written out, what are all the different types of enemy to lover situations? Like what are the origin stories for these? So we have 5 of them. So we're just going to kind of talk about each of these. We're going to, mention a few notable works and just kind of jam on it. So the one I want to start with is actually past conflict because you just mentioned it. So in past conflict enemies to lovers scenarios, it typically refers to in their past, usually childhood or young adolescence, something occurred that they hate each other because of that. Maybe it was bullying, maybe it was a school prank, maybe like the boy you loved asked you to the school dance, but he was really just joking. He took your friend of me. Like, but because of this past conflict, when they meet again later in life, they are bringing forward that from their childhood into the current situation, and then they have to navigate that. So some of the examples for this that spring to mind are Benedict and Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, bringing in some Shakespeare here, some
Love that.
literature, because the implication of the play is that they had a relationship when they were younger. It ended badly, and now they're just full of really snappy, witty dialogue. I love Much Ado
There's
About
such
Nothing.
good banter in that book, in
Um,
that play.
it's exactly. Another example would be Anne of Green Gables, bringing to you the PEI representation for me being from the East Coast. But Anne and Gilbert, he called her carrot, he pulled her pigtails, literally a trope of he doesn't know how to talk to you, so he pulls your pigtails.
That's probably where it comes from. Is like it came out of Anne of Green Gables. That may be the origin of the pulling of the pigtails.
Exactly. So I think past conflict is kind of interesting. To your point, though, as long as it doesn't devolve into like the like abuse, and it was both, I feel like both people have to be complicit in this. Otherwise, it's a little bit too sketch for me. But one of the reasons I kind of like past conflict as a reason for current day enemies to lovers is you get to start the story as late in the story as possible. You don't have to
Mm-hmm.
spend all of this time building up why and how they got there. A lot of these devices will use flashbacks usually to show like the moment or how it did start. Maybe prior to this prank or whatever happening, they did actually have kind of a relationship, but then this one moment destroyed everything. But I like that it allows you to start the story as late in the story as possible. And then you do get to see them reconcile the past perception, this idea of what actually there's what actually happened, then there's each side's perspective on what happened. You get to reconcile that. So I find past conflict enemies to lovers satisfying in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Especially if there's some sort of second chance that goes along with it. If it is, we were a very good couple, and then there was some sort of, adjustment that happened, some sort of conflict that happened. We broke up, and now we're still in this world together. Like, how many of us have had to deal with exes in our same social group or bump into them later in life?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, oh, but it didn't work, but there was some sort of spark there.
Ooh, that's actually an interesting one that you just said there. That I think an added layer to this past conflict version of enemies to lovers is they were lovers or whatever version they were, at whatever age they were, and then something happens to split them up, and then they come back. So, for example, like they,
Ooh.
some being high school sweethearts, and then like there's a fight or a prank, or they overhear something, or even like you said we were going to go to college together, and you chose Harvard, and I'm going to USC, and I'm angry that you made decisions without me, and then they break up, and like there's that whole thing when they come back together of like you lied to me, you left me. So I actually, that's an added layer of past conflict, is maybe they hated each other, but then maybe they were together and then broke up because of this conflict, and then it's about coming back to it.
Right. If you get lovers to enemies to lovers, then you have all of that conflict and all of that tension and friction, but you also know that there was something there at the beginning. Versus a lot of enemies to lovers, they just come in hot, right? And they come in and they hate each other and you don't always understand why. But if they had a previous relationship that failed, then you get a little bit of enemies to lovers and a little bit of second chance. And second chance is also one of my top 10 favorite tropes. So
yeah. Well, I mean, I think it makes sense in a lot of ways too for driving the narrative forward in what I'll refer to as present day, like the moment where they are coming back and being like, "No, it's you." It's this idea that, like, for most books I've read that have this particular aspect of the trope, it's like that relationship has formed the basis for all their relationships to date, for good or for ill. So this idea sometimes is used of you ruined me for everyone, and everyone they date is like, oh, this person left me, so I think everybody's going to leave me, and that's kind of gone through all their romances. So in some ways, I find that really interesting. Of like this moment of conflict in the past that is present now when they are reunited in the present day. It's like how much of that has affected where they are with other people in their life. Not only their thoughts about this individual, but like their thoughts about where they are now, and like that provides such great narrative potential for things to go fucking wrong. And I love it.
And I think also if you have that past relationship and you have people who saw you in that past relationship and then still see you now, there is a certain connection of like, oh, are you still going on about this? Or like, would you just get back together already? You know, so you have a bit of that external peer pressure of, would you either shut up about him or move on? You know?
I think
Them,
it's so true.
not him
So there was an
necessarily.
article on Days Digital that was written by Kimberly Bond, and in that article, she interviews Marissa Peer, who's this relationship expert therapist, and they were talking about why do we love this genre. And Peer basically said that when you have an enemies to lovers situation, I think especially with this kind of framing device with past conflict, all they have been focusing on to date has been the flaws of the other person, and then exaggerated them to fit with their preconception of like this, what Peer refers to as an archetypal enemy. You almost blown it up in your head because of the passage of time to be like their flaws are all that they are, and they don't have any redeeming qualities. So then the narrative structure then they have to learn how to communicate. They have to learn how to negotiate and observe who that person really is, and then like uncover the positive they're in it, because hopefully there's positive. That's why they end up together. But again, it's this idea of like you've blown them up to be this thing, or you've blown up that conflict point to be this thing, and then it's like it's not, or you have to get over it in order for the narrative to continue.
And I think you can also like as the narrator, you can have it go two ways, which is this person is not good and then they become better, versus my perception of this person is not good and they're not actually that bad of a person, but I as the narrator, I as the point of view character have these incomplete perceptions of this person, and I need to change the way that I look at them. You know, so sometimes you have like a Darcy character who like did not do a great job at expressing his feelings, and then when Lizzie declined his proposal, he was like, oh shit, I need to change the way that I talk to people, right? So there can be an enemies to lovers that the enmity between them changes that person's behavior, but you can also have these kind of they're secretly a good person and you're blocking that out. So like the hating game, which I know we're going to talk about also, like Lucy is completely oblivious to everything that Josh does that's good. But he has a lot of these little like save the cat moments of like he does something nice for her but she doesn't recognize it because she has created this perception of him disliking her, you know. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
it can be done either way of maybe the conflict between them changes that person, or maybe the belief and the perception has to change, and it can be both, and that's another thing that makes the
Mm-hmm.
genre and the trope really interesting.
Ooh, okay. I love that you brought up Darcy because that segues very beautifully into the next type of enemies to lovers, which is around this idea of a misunderstanding or that of a mistaken identity. So basically, one party usually feels some kind of way about something they heard the other character say, either firsthand or through someone else. So in the case of Darcy and Elizabeth from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, it's depicted as Elizabeth overhears Darcy say like, "Yeah, I'm not gonna dance with her. Nobody in this room is attractive enough for me to spend any sort of time with." And she's like, "Squeeze me, bitch." And obviously things continue. So this idea of like this like misunderstanding, which often involves miscommunication, to your point, as well as we bring this up a lot in another episode we recently recorded on R.S. Gray's Their Last Resort. This idea of a misunderstanding has occurred and nobody is having a freaking conversation about it to clear it up. So with this trope, Pride and Prejudice is one of them. Red, White, and Royal Blue, Vacation
That
Quiston.
book.
I love the book, love the movie. But again, the whole conflict between the two characters in Red, White, and Royal Blue is, I felt that you treated me like shit at this thing. And this also kind of goes into a past conflict type of thing. But they just misunderstood what the other one was saying. He was like, I was really nervous and I felt very uncomfortable. And Alex is like, I thought you were excluding me. We love it. Another example of this one, which is one of my favorite books of this genre, is Wallbanger by Alice Clayton.
Ooh, I haven't read that one.
So good. Basically, it's two neighbors, and this man and this woman live next to each other in San Francisco. They share a wall, and the guy, she nicknames him Wallbanger because he often has guests over that involve, when the bed isn't knocking against the wall, don't come knocking, and they end up in conflict over this perception of, one, you keep me up all the time with your freaking wall banging. It turns out they have mutual friends, including their bosses. Anyway, and it's involved in a couple other books, but we do love Wallbanger. But okay,
Instant download. It is on my Kindle now. It's waiting for me.
beautiful. It's a great book. Okay, Meg, what are we thinking about like this initial misunderstanding or miscommunication that leads to "I shall never love you"? Oh no, wait, I do.
I love it. I love like a bad first impression. Whether it is, because like how often does that happen? And like as somebody who can come off as too loud or too in your face, like having a person who's
No.
shy be like, I know, right? Having somebody who's shy be like, I don't know about this girl, like, and I feel the same way where I'm like, oh, they're kind of standoffish, like it's so common, and it can be kind of insidious. It can be something that changes your perception about that person that may or may not be accurate. Like it feels so natural to me to have these misconceptions and misunderstandings and have that be just unclear. And like you don't go up to people and you're like, hey, are you shy or are you mean? Like,
I kind of wish we did. I feel like, excuse me, are you shy and antisocial, or are you just being a dick right now? Thank you. I can now adjust my conceptions of how I'm going to communicate with you. I do like this though, because I think I love also this aspect of the genre. Like to me, this is very much like this is Darcy. He puts his foot in it. Because one, of
mm-hmm.
how he was raised, but two, I feel like he's not great socially. He says that later in the book and in the movie of like, I do not find it easy to converse with people, so I say stupid shit or things I don't want to. I love this trope. Where I do think it can go wrong, though, for me, is if all it would take is a conversation and they have multiple opportunities to have that conversation and it still doesn't happen. And, I think this works more so with more contemporary books because we can access people at any time between all of social media and emails and texting and phones. Like it's so easy to get in touch with someone if you really wanted to, whereas perhaps in Austen's time, men and women are rarely alone, so they can actually have a conversation. And there's so much like language about how you talk and how you speak with people you are not acquainted with or acquainted with. The only time for me that this gets annoying is especially in contemporary when there has been this misunderstanding and nobody fucking brings it up when they have multiple opportunities. It's just like, we've all been to therapy by now. Just say, hey, name, I feel adjective when you verb. Like, can we talk?
I think when it's like a one-time problem that then nobody talks about, that bothers me. But I think a one-time misperception can then lead to future misperceptions. And I think also it can be really interesting if there is also like a values misalignment that's happening here. So I mean, I'm a writer, and my fourth book in the series, which won't be out for a really long time, is Enemies to Lovers. And I love writing it because they fundamentally disagree on a lot of things. And they get from that first impression, it's workplace, and therefore, she's a social media influencer. He's a PR person, like a traditional PR person. He's like, you shouldn't be talking about all this sex stuff. And she's like, why not? This is how I am, like you can also start from a fundamental misunderstanding or miscommunication, but we also need to see that miscommunication continue. We need strong, and here's the other thing, if it's just like, you were mean to me once, it's not as exciting as if you have two individual characters who have their own perspectives, who disagree on the behavior, and therefore they can continue to fall into judgment of each other. That's what makes it fun for me.
Yeah, when it almost becomes like a point scoring exercise.
Yes.
Like, I like a good witty repartee with Enemies to Lovers when I can almost feel them doing that. Like the checkpoint for me. Ah, damn, he got that point. Like, I do think that's kind of fun because it keeps it like not necessarily lighter, but it's like they're both like they're fully
both
aware. They're in it. And whereas going back to the same Days Digital article with Kimberly Mond, she also interviews Dr. Tony Ortega, who's a clinical psychologist and has written a lot of books about romantic relationships. He brings up something that I think can often come into this version of the trope called affect tolerance. Basically, your ability to engage with negative emotions over time, and the more you engage with a certain behavior, the stronger it gets. So the challenge can be like, one, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and then out of proportion, or two, you become so desensitized to it and you grow a tolerance for the level of kind of back and forth and antagonism that's there, that you get used to it. And to me, that can very easily slide into the abuse side of this, that you just get so used to how someone speaks to you or how you think, that it can kind of go that way. So I think that's kind of like the downside of this aspect of the trope, but I do love it when it's like ooh, I got that one. Shit, you got that one. Like a little tennis match going back and forth. That's when it's fun.
Especially when it's banter. Okay, so I do want to give a caveat that something that I hate in Enemies to Lovers is when you get this back and forth and it turns into silly pranks. I'm like, come on, we are all adults. Like, this is not a situation where we're going to like put Kool-Aid in your shower to make it funny. Like, just because it's a rom-com doesn't mean it has to be silly or like goofy. Like, you can find a way to write it that makes it interesting to read without being juvenile or pranky.
Yeah, especially like workplace ones really get me when we get into the next trope, which we're going to talk about, is like when there's competition or rivalry and they're like, you know what? I hate you. I'm going to fuck with your presentation and put like a naked mole rat in it, which I don't love. So let's segue into the third type of enemies to lovers, which is competition and rivalry. So this is when your main characters are either in competition, seeking the same opportunity at work, maybe it's a promotion, or they might be going after the same romantic interest. Like, oh, who will this person pick? I both have to date them. So you brought up the hating game.
Sort of love triangle situation where you're both trying to.
So you brought up the hating game by Sally Thorne. Another one of my favorites for this one is by, it's a co-write between Onley James and Neb Wilder. It's called Play Dirty, which is book 2 in the Wages of Sin. And it's two assassins. One of them is like a sniper. One of them is poisons. And so it's basically long contact and close contact assassins and kind of fighting over the same targets. Obviously, it gets very sexy times later. And they do kind of have that pranking. It's like one of them steals the other one's bullets so they can't shoot their target. The other one like uses their own poison against them and like knocks them out so he can go get a target. So competition and rivalry, again, love it. As long as you don't fuck with my job.
Yeah, I think sometimes this can be really interesting, especially in a rivals way, where they're on, you have a sports romance and they're on different teams and they've been pitted against each other, even if there's not any sort of misunderstanding at the beginning of it. So I'm thinking of like Heated Rivalry by Rachel Rogers, where
Mhm.
like they originally, it starts in the present. But like 10 years ago, one was a Russian hockey aficionado and the other was a Canadian. And they kept getting pitted up as like, who's the rookie of the year? And then
Mhm.
the PR firms were like, oh, they're both up for the same award and they're going to play on opposing teams. And then they start to hook up, obviously, and like have to keep it secretive.
Mhm.
There's no forced outing in this one, but it is like they have been pit against each other publicly in the press, and
Ooh,
that
that's a
is
good
why.
one.
Yeah, so like being able to have this sort of like external enemies to lovers where they actually don't dislike they're rivals, but they don't dislike each other, but they've been told that they're supposed
Yeah.
to act like they dislike each other. That also adds a
Mhm.
certain level of depth and emotion where it's like we're secretly seeing each other, but like we have to pretend that we hate each other, and that makes it, and they're both so competitive that on the ice when they
Yeah.
face off, they actually are competitive, and then it leads into the bedroom later on.
Love that. Yeah, I do like that when it's like when characters come into the story and they either like don't know the other person or they don't have a relationship, but there is that external like we think there's because we know the press does things with their storylines as it becomes
Right.
a person like so and so is feuding with so and so is a drama queen on set like so this is kind of manufactured rivalry where really none existed or didn't really exist in the way that it's being portrayed in the press or in the media. I think that's actually really fascinating because it's almost like the only skin in the game that the characters would have at that point is they want the title or the prize or the opportunity. They don't like there's nothing there with the other person, so then they kind of have to it goes back to this idea of like preconceived notions of like, well, the press is putting us together and maybe somebody gives them a sound bite and now they're like, oh, well, they said that about me in the press and it could have just been totally taken out of context. Like, I love that. I hadn't even thought about like external forces creating the enemies to lovers when really it didn't exist to begin with.
And I think also you gave me this recommendation, and I saw it on your list too, which is Not All Himbos Wear Capes, and that whole
Mm-hmm.
series where it is superheroes and supervillains who are not in every single one of them, but often it's this kind of forced, well, I am a villain and therefore I am not supposed to be in relationship with this hero, and some of that's mistaken identity and secret identity and stuff too, which I also love. But this external force of I have been told that I am not supposed to engage with this type of person. And maybe there's some class
Mm-hmm.
in there too. I know that's like maybe there's
Yeah.
some overlap there with
Mm-hmm.
class and demographics and internal implicit bias that shows up
Mm-hmm.
in the ways that we're raised in
Yeah.
society.
It's true, and I love that you brought up "Not All Himbos Wear Capes." So, series by C. Rochelle, fantastic series. And I would just like to point out for everyone that in the first book, the superhero names of our two main characters, one of whom is a superhero, one of whom is a supervillain, it is Captain Masculine and Doctor Antihero. Phenomenal series. The first book in the next spinoff is actually it's coming out in a couple weeks. Not All Earth Boys Are Easy, I think is what it's called. But the Villainous Things series, phenomenal series. But yeah, um, it definitely, like, yeah, because of who we are, we're in competition for something. Clearly, we have to disagree on whatever it is that we're trying to do, whether it's to save the population or it's just to cause chaos. And the other, I want to create chaos that you try to save, and I'm trying to minimize the chaos that you're creating. I love it. Okay, you brought up class.
And like family expectations too, because a big part of that is what
Mm.
is the family's expectation of who you end up with.
Oh, okay. I love this. So the next one on my list of like types of enemies to lovers relationships, one of that is class. So basically, someone is automatically at odds because of their economic work or privilege situation. So Beautiful Bastard by Christina Lauren comes up for me here. It's kind of
Ooh,
like a
I wouldn't.
boss.
Yeah, I don't know if that's class so much as power.
Yeah, for me, that's why I kind of say class slash like privilege and power for me
Okay. Yep.
are
Yep.
kind of what's in there. Overboard, like Kurt Russell, Goldie Hawn,
Oh,
automatically like rich bitch with
yeah.
no seat or shoe closet. And also for you anime and manga fans, Hanayari Dango is a big one for this between Tsukushi and Domyoji. The J drama for this show is phenomenal. This one for me gets a little bit too close to like that more abusive side, especially early on in the season, because basically Tsukushi is a scholarship student essentially at this really expensive academy, and Domyoji is like the son of this huge company or organization that is like multi billions of dollars, and automatically he's like, oh, scholarship student. She's like, you're a rich asshole, which he is, but has a really great one. So yeah, this idea of class and power and privilege within enemies to lovers. What do we think about this one? This one for me is the hardest one to navigate.
I think it can go badly, but I think it makes
Mm-hmm.
it so much more interesting because we do. I mean, every single one of us shows up with a preconceived notion of where we fit within society and how our privilege impacts us. And I think it can also be a really interesting space for authors to explore how to break down class and privilege and how to navigate it from, especially like how to break it down from the more privileged character and what their expectations are. So like Darcy being able to say like, yeah, I have a lot of money, but that doesn't mean that I have to look down on Lizzie's family, right? That recognition of our own power and privilege as part of the character arc can be really interesting. And also like for the we'll say lower class or less privileged hero or character to be able to say like, oh, not all rich people, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's a defensiveness that shows up
Yeah.
among the less privileged person to be like, oh, well, that alpha character is like this, or this boss character is like this, because they just have this sort of defensiveness that appears. That can be really interesting
Yeah.
for that internality and those preconceived notions.
Yeah. Because when you're throwing together characters in that situation, especially when there is kind of that imbalance or just because of the station they have in life, but to put characters together where they have to learn how to communicate, they have to learn how to like negotiate, and as much as they might disdain that other person because you grew up with everything type of deal and I had nothing, or everything comes so easy to you and I had to work my ass off, they have to like really learn how to understand that other person and recognize that like the sum of their parts together form something. Because I just read this book and Hostile. I can't remember the author off the top of my head. I will look it up. But basically, it's a young man in college. He's 18, and his professor, who is 26. This one I had a little bit of ick in because I was like, teacher student, which is not my favorite. But basically, this teacher, this professor, is looking down on this student because like he's so cocky. He comes from a rich family. Everything's easy. He finds out though that like this kid spent the entirety of his life in abusive foster care before he was adopted by very wealthy parents who, and he's like, I let them spoil me because it makes them feel good, but I'm actually really smart. And then the student is looking at the professor and going, wow, you're an asshole. You're really uptight. He goes, this job is all I had because I also grew up in foster care, but I was not saved. So everything I have created in my life, I did for myself. And I will never put power into someone else's hands over my fate. I cannot lose this job because I would lose my house, and all I've wanted my entire life is a home. So like there's that
Ooh,
like
those are some
so
stakes.
they find out later they're both foster kids that came from really rough situations. Their just exit from that was very, very different. But it puts them at this weird, because they both came from what I will say very low socioeconomic path with not a lot of power. And they've both risen. One got adopted by a very wealthy family, and one is a university professor at the age of 26. So like they're almost on the same ground again, and they came from the same ground, but their perception of what that ground is still very much steeped in perception of each other and being like, well, you're clearly higher class than me, not knowing that the student came from foster care. It's a great book. I'm going to look up the author because I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I just read it yesterday, and I really enjoyed how they played with that.
I love when they come from similar backgrounds and have had different experiences, and therefore they come to it with their own baggage. And then they get a chance to
Mm-hmm.
explore like the what if of it. It's almost like the sliding doors of it all. Is like, what if I had been adopted by a different family, or what if my mom had made a different decision? What if we hadn't moved that time? Like that's always so interesting to
Mm-hmm.
explore.
Yes, it's Too Hostile by Nicole Dykes. Um, Very good. Highly recommend.
Thumbs up on
All
that
right.
one.
Well, This kind of transitioned us into the last type of enemies to lovers on my list, which is the idea of generational enmity. So, where because of who their family is or even their country, they cannot be around each other. So, obvious example for this one is Romeo and Juliet. Again, they're not necessarily enemies, but their families are, and that's created something. Mafia romances. This shows up a lot in mafia romances. Like you're not, West Side Story. Like this two gangs, these two mafia families. Kira Andrews did a really kind of fun historical duet called the Barbarian's Vow series, where basically two countries are at war, and to like save the country, one of the countries essentially sells their son to the barbarian leader of the other country. So from the very beginning, the barbarian is like, you are this country who I think is stupid, and like you're weak and you're pampered people, and this guy is like, you're literally a barbarian leader who has stolen me from my country. So we got that one. And I was even thinking, like, to some extent, Game of Thrones, like Khal Drogo and Dany, at least at the beginning, are kind of that as well, like opposing families, opposing countries or cultures in a way, kind of creating much feud, like, Hatfields and McCoys, not necessarily romance, but it's that same idea of, because of the background or place that we are coming from, automatically conflict is created.
I love when the the characters are steeped in a culture where they're not supposed to like each other, and so they therefore have to overcome not only their family dynamics but the society expectations of them. Like Romeo and Juliet is a little bit different because they don't know who each other are at that, and they're at the costume party and they don't recognize each other, and she's so much younger, so that's a little bit different. But a lot of times for the mafia romances, like, it can be, we're from different families or different cultures. Sometimes it's not just like the 5 Italian families and they're in different sort of.
It's the Italians and the Russians and
Right.
the
It's usually
Irish.
the Irish, right? The Irish and a
Yeah.
Russian. And so they like split up between these families, and often there's some sort of like forced proximity, or, like, I kidnapped the girlfriend of the person from book one, and
Yeah.
so, you get those opportunities where you have to have conversations where you're forced to be together and realize, like, oh, I actually don't hate this person that I have been raised my entire life to hate. So it's not even a
Yeah.
personal vendetta at that point. It's like, I have been raised to believe that I am in some way superior to this person, which can bring it back to class, or that this person has done something to harm my family and therefore I need to have loyalty. So you can thematically pull on a lot of strings there, about what the expectation is and what your role is in your family, your culture, your society, your country, versus individual needs and relationships.
Yeah, I love that. And again, just to kind of go more on the mafia side of it, Sylvia Violet, I think it is. She has the Marchese family mafia series, which kind of has, like, obviously similar vibes to that, in that you have like this main family, the Marcheses, and they're either fighting with other families, they're fighting with the cops. And obviously, at one point, one of the characters falls in love with a cop. Ooh, what happens? One of them
Ooh.
goes with like a rival family. So, yeah, there is kind of like this interesting bit, because then not only do they have to navigate each other and how they communicate with each other and the perceptions they might have of each other, it's like the greater family, like what they've heard from other families, or they have to hide it or be secretive in such a way their families don't find out.
Yes. And I think this makes it really, like, when you and I first started talking about this was the kind of enemy that came to mind for me first, because it is in like a larger stakes universe. It's really hard to do legitimate enemies by the dictionary definition of enemies in a contemporary, because, like, if you don't like someone that much, you just like walk off, like, you need to have some sort of stakes. So I find that when we're actually talking about like legitimate enemies, it's often in historical, or it is in some sort of heightened reality like a mafia romance, or something that I was just thinking about as you were talking, and we haven't discussed it all, is like paranormal species of like, you're
Oh,
a
it's a great one.
Yeah, you're a vampire and he's a werewolf, and you're not supposed to like each other, but he didn't know that you were a vampire when he saved you from that demon, and therefore, like, and so often paranormal books have some sort of thematic, we're all in this together, we're all the same vibe to them, but
Mm-hmm.
it's like interspecies romances can feel like a stand-in for like a multicultural or class-based romance where these families are pitted against each other, these species are pitted against each other. Oh, the witches aren't supposed to be with the demons, but look, I fell in love with a witch, but maybe she's actually a
Yes.
demon. Like, and you can kind of
What?
play with some of the societal expectations without needing to be like, well, you're black and I'm white. Like, it doesn't have to
Mm-hmm.
exist in our reality, but you can do an urban fantasy that feels more contemporary by pulling in these species opportunities.
Yeah, and then those, like, again, to your point about if you were to bring in like race into it the way that we understand it and people interact with it in our current kind of reality, then we're also bringing in so much of our own experience and
Mm-hmm.
own thoughts about that, that sometimes, that can kind of, I don't want to say it's bad, but and I don't want to say it takes away from the enjoyment of reading, but it's almost like it's extra stuff to talk about. Where if you can use something like a paranormal or a mafia or these heightened reality to kind of be the vehicle for that, I feel like it makes it easier to read. I don't know if that's quite, I don't think I'm quite explaining myself, but hopefully
No,
you're
I get
getting what I'm
what
putting
you're
down.
saying. Like, I've had several conversations with my friend Alexa Martin, who is a Black woman author, and she writes Black characters or biracial characters. And she finds that her feedback from her readers comes in a lot more critical anytime that her heroines are strong and who push back, because there's this sort of fundamental societal like, well, she's just an angry black woman, and Alexa has to be very
Mm,
careful as an author about who she's choosing and what those are, versus if that character were a witch, she could just be mean. Right? So there's something that there's an implicit bias from the reader that you have to take into consideration when you're presenting it as a
mhm.
potential reality of a contemporary, versus by taking the contemporary reality out of it and putting it into a historical or into a paranormal or into another
Yes,
circumstance.
I find myself quite biased against werewolves. Just saying. Okay, so outside, is there, when I start thinking about just broadly enemies to lovers, do you have any other favorites that like stand out? Like a big one in pop culture today is Kate and Anthony from season two and
Oh yeah.
the Book of Bridgerton. Again, I mentioned in a previous episode that I pretty much grew up on fan fiction. So Hermione and Draco is a
Oh,
really big
Hermione.
ship
Yes.
in Harry Potter, a fic that's not canon. One that is canon is on the TV show Once Upon a Time. Emma and Killian. Oh my god! Like I didn't watch all of that show, but I will say Killian, like Captain Hook, hands down best character on that show. But like their whole relationship arc of that enemies to lovers was really really good. Any other favorite enemies to lovers that you have?
I think we're going to get into this in a future episode, but A Court of Thorn and Roses has
Mm-hmm.
sort of enemies to lovers. People have marked book 2 as enemies to lovers. I disagree. I think book 4 is a much better enemies to lovers, A Court of Silver
Mm-hmm.
Flames. Um, and because I read paranormal, I feel like this is always showing up in paranormal. One that I really love in particular is A Deal with a Demon by Stasia Stark. That whole series is she's a witch and he's a demon, and she has to steal a sword from him to find out, because she's also like mercenary, so she's trying to find out who killed her mother, and so she's got this a plot of trying to find the murderer, and he might have the information, and so they sort of butt heads the whole way through. But then it builds upon that misunderstanding and this power dynamic, but then she can still be a strong character. So I love that within that paranormal space a lot.
Ooh, that's like the Speak of the Demon, Dance with the Demon series.
Yeah, Speak of the Demon is the first book there. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna look in two. that one.
And I'll add one more that is very contemporary, and I
Oh,
think they do
yes.
a fantastic job with it. It's also a workplace romance. It's Practice Makes Perfect by Julie James, where they are both lawyers. They are both like, it has a little bit of class where he's from more of an upscale family and she had to work hard to make her way through law school. And there's only one partnership opportunity at their law firm and they're both going after it. But they've always had this sort of enmity because they're rivals. And I think that that's always a really interesting space to be. And I think a lot of the hockey romances that I read are also in the enemies to lovers space. So those are, the Puck Boy series
Love
that
that.
have talked about before, the Heated
Mm-hmm.
Rivalry series. I think those are all good choices if you're just getting started with enemies to lovers.
Yeah.
And the hating game. We sort of glossed over the hating game, but I think that that is in some ways like the
Mm-hmm.
iconic contemporary of enemies to lovers.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to give that one a reread. And I'll say like another suggestion I would have for this genre would be Tavia Lark, her Perilous Courts series. So it's currently at 6 books, but it's like 2 trilogies. And each trilogy deals with the princes of one nation. And then the second trilogy deals with the princes of the other nation. And there's a lot of drama. It's high fantasy. It's got some phenomenal tropes, great characters. There's definitely some enemies to lovers in there, especially when you start getting into like one of the, is it Dragon Riders, I think is his title. There's some really cool ones that kind of come in there. So that's like Prince the Assassin, Prince in Disguise, Prince in the Pawn, and then you have Prince and Bodyguard, Prince and Betrothed, and Prince of Agony. Prince of Agony was the last one in the last trilogy, and it was phenomenal. It was so good. So Tavia Lark's Perilous Court series, also highly recommend if you do love an enemies to lovers trope.
Excellent. And I think also,
Awesome.
I'm a huge fan of Emily Henry, and I think her Beach Read does a really good job of setting it up in a very low stakes space where it's like they're neighbors, they're both writing books, they think they don't like each other, and then they have this little competition to see who can write the style of book, and they come to appreciate each other. So it doesn't always have to be this super high stakes, big world building. Sometimes it can just be a little town in Maine where there's two authors who are writing on each other's decks, right? Like if you are like, I
And
don't want them.
are they neighbors with Jessica Fletcher and Murder She Wrote? Because she's also in Maine, and I would read that.
Maybe she's one of the neighbors. I can't remember, but I love it. Well,
I love
I
that.
thank you for gathering up your Nikki's six, your 5 different types of enemies to lovers. I really appreciated all of your hard work, sort of building out a framework here for this.
Thank you. I'm an operations queen who loves a good framework. All right. Before we move in for the close, a gentle and loving reminder to please go subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Helps us move up them ranks, helps more people find us through the magic of the algorithm, which I don't understand, but I am victim to it every single day of my life.
Every day, we're all
We
just
greatly
birds for
appreciate you.
algorithms.
All right, Meg, what are you reading, writing, ranting, or raving about this week?
I am raving about a book that I just finished reading. It turns out that there is another mom who lives in my neighborhood who she has already put out her debut novel and she's putting out her second novel next month. Her name is Nora Pritchard, and her first book I just finished. It's called The Other Side of Forever, and her next book comes out next month. It's called Maybe Someday with You. It's small town. It's actually like clearly based in our town, but has been a little bit anonymized, which is really satisfying to read. And you and I can talk about this ad nauseum at another point where it's like, oh yeah, I've been to that street. I know exactly where they're camped out. I know which house is her mother's house. Like it's very satisfying.
Yeah.
But it's also just like, especially after I just ranted about paranormals and dark romance and stuff, like this is a very sweet, small town, single dad, single mom, widowed parent romance. And sometimes you need something that just like, is like candy for your soul,
Mm-hmm.
So I really
Give me
love
that cupcake.
exactly. So I really love The Other Side of Forever. I'm looking forward to maybe someday with you. What
Love it.
about you, Nikki? Reading, writing, ranting, or raving?
This week for me, it is Chloe Archer's Monsters Hollow series. The most recent book of that series just came out, and the most recent one was called The Gargoyle and the Romance Writer. This is a queer supernatural series. The prequel novel was called The Boogeyman and the School Teacher. Book 1 in the series was The Orc and the Manny. And now we have The Gargoyle and the Romance Writer. Again, supernatural for me is often hit or miss. But really enjoying this. So the gargoyle is a bodyguard Then you have a human romance writer who has come to this town to write his book and escape a stalker. And his friend, and the reason he came to this town, he was the main character in The Orc and the Manny. He was the Manny who came to this Monsters Hollow town. So really fun. Of course, the human writer is a romance author. So he loves like swoony romance novels. He writes in this universe, humans are aware of the creatures referred to as other kind. So they know that orcs exist. They know that vampires exist. So Ryder writes other kind and human romance novels. So one of his most endearing character traits is he'll go up to a new supernatural creature he's never seen before. And he'll be like, how do you procreate? Can I please see your penis? Like, how do you do this? Like when he first met the gargoyle character, who is his love interest in this book, first thing he asked was, can I please see your penis? Because he wanted to make sure that his books were factually accurate as he was.
This is a sensitivity reading situation. It's authenticity readers.
Fun. It's very fun. Then, of course, the gargoyle is Vash Darkwing, and he is the bodyguard for him against
that
the
is
stalker.
A great gargoyle
so
name.
Very good. Gargoyle and the Romance Writer by Chloe Archer. It's the latest book in her Monsters Hollow series. 10 out of 10 recommend if you love supernatural penises.
And who doesn't? If you love supernatural penises and you want to hear more from us about them and all things romance, we're going to encourage you to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever your podcasting tool of choice is, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever you're using. We're also going to encourage you to come on over to Instagram and follow us at First Dates and Soulmates. DM us, let us know what you think about the episodes, and we will see you next week.
Bye!